a lot of people in the United States, especially young people, identify as socialist of some nature. And so, with the lowering of quality of life, wages being cut, rent increasing, the question of why be a socialist seems almost self explanatory. The question now is why be anti imperialist? And perhaps you can give us some insight on that.
I think being a socialist and not being an anti-imperialist is what was called social fascism back in the day. And so what that means is that you are a socialist really in name only, and you support the aggression of the imperialist countries in crushing socialist movements, yeah, beyond your borders or even within. It all depends on your political position. What it means to be an anti-imperialist is to struggle for the defense of the defenseless, for solidarity with those under oppression and domination, and really to fight against this highest form of monopoly capital. That is what imperialism is. So anti-imperialism is fighting against this bloc that control financial markets, that use economics as a weapon, that use monetary policy to govern. And you remember Kwame Nkrumah and the neo-colonialism speaking about basically, that African nations were getting their independence, but were quickly back in a state of servitude to international financial institutions. Who comes to mind? The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, many of these massive entities that were created in the post-war environment to dominate a lot of the post-colonial, newly independent countries. And so what I think is necessary is an anti-imperialist movement that always places the US, the European Union, and NATO, its military alliance, always at the forefront of the greatest harm done around the world, because that's what it is. We see the peaceful development of places like China, which instead of 2 or 3 decades of war, have developed their people, have developed their country, have lifted millions out of extreme poverty to the point where extreme poverty no longer exists in China. How embarrassed are we as Americans in this country, seeing that we don't even have high-speed rail, we have no universal healthcare system, we have no good quality of education across the board. We have communities, especially you and I know this well, you growing up on a farm and me being a farmer here in Vermont, our rural communities are falling apart. Both parties speak about families, but they don't care about families at the end of the day. They care about the dollars. They care about their financial portfolios. They care about their country clubs and their good cigars and their big yachts and their golf, their golf clubs. So I think that when we're thinking about anti-imperialism, anti-imperialism is not only beyond our borders, but it's within, because an anti-imperialist struggle will put the focus back on our needs as well, because the empire wants to enrich the military industrial complex. It wants to enrich Boeing and Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. It wants to enrich really bad nation states who are doing egregious things like the Zionist state, so-called Israel. And so when you see these things happening, you have to realize that the struggle is here. The struggle must be against US-EU NATO imperialism. And then that struggle has within it both an external international dimension, but an internal dimension where you say, we want our needs met. We want bread. We want peace. We want land. We want our rural communities to be strong. We want our urban centers to be revitalized. We want people to have decent educations, decent standards of living, to live with dignity, to not be under constant debt, to not have education be a burden, to not have healthcare costs be so egregious that people die because they don't have coverage. What kind of a country is this that ends up saying that we are the greatest empire and we're the remade Rome and Britain? This is our age, the Pax Americana. No, this is barbarism. And I think that when you understand that as an anti-imperialist, you recognize that what the US does to its own people, it exports. Because what it did to enslaved Africans and indigenous people, it ended up exporting it beyond our borders, oppressing countries like Venezuela and Cuba and Iran and the DPRK and China and Syria and Yemen and now in Ethiopia, the conflict there, and all over. The US has been trying to stop people from rising up, taking their self-determination in their hands and saying, we want to have a different form. We want to have a form that cares about people and their dignity. And as somebody who wore the uniform of this country, I know all too well that many of the veterans and the people who served, some of whom, like myself, resigned, conscientiously objecting to the empire. We recognize that those people also need to be reached out to. That actually some of the greatest groups out there, like Veterans for Peace and many others, are at the anti-imperialist front. They are out front and center, and they say, we have lived through this, we saw it. What good was it to go and send boys to die on the battlefields, or girls to go and die on the battlefields of Vietnam or of Iraq, of Afghanistan? Why? For what reason? To enrich the military industrial complex, to enrich the monopoly capitalists, right? We remember Smedley Butler, war is a racket. So if we have that at the forefront and we have that as a banner, young socialists have to recognize that they have to see Washington, the national security state, the history of the CIA, the history of assassinations and coups and regime change as the main enemy of the people, not only of the American people, of all the peoples of the world. And with that understanding, we can see more clearly who the enemies are and who the enemies that are portrayed to us actually are, which are actually our friends and comrades that we need to be in solidarity with.